Hi, everyone. I'm Kara Danksy. I'm the president of the U.S. chapter of Women's Declaration International. Welcome to this evening's webinar on Living the Declaration. Tonight, we're focusing on Article 8 of the Declaration on Women's Sex-Based Rights. And the purpose of these webinars is really to dig into the text and the content of the Declaration on Women's Sex-Based Rights and really talk about how important the Declaration is in the lives of individual women and share stories of how it's impacted us and might continue to impact us in our lives. So this is a women-only webinar for the live portion. And if there are any men present now, we ask you to leave, and we would very much appreciate it if you would watch the recording on the YouTube once it's posted. But for now, we're just women only for purposes of the discussion and the chat. So welcome, everyone. Tonight, I am very excited that we have with us Genevieve Gluck, Carmen Speer, and April Morrow to discuss their insights about Article 8, which is on reaffirming the need for the elimination of male violence against women. And as the facilitator, I thought I would get started tonight by actually reading the text of Article 8, because as devoted as many of us are to the Declaration on Women's Sex-Based Rights, probably many of us do not spend a lot of time reading it word for word. And I wanted to get us grounded in the language of the actual Declaration. And as I was preparing for tonight's webinar, I was reflecting on how the Declaration incorporates a lot of language that exists in other documents of international law that focus on the importance of women and girls. But because, as we all know, the word sex is rapidly changing to mean gender identity, protection of sex is going to become increasingly less relevant or less able to protect women and girls as a sex class if sex is completely redefined. And so what the Declaration really does is pinpoint how exactly the language of international law documents need to be interpreted and read in order to protect women and girls as intended. So I'm going to read the language of Article 8. It's a little bit long, bear with me, and then I'll introduce our speakers. Article 8, reaffirming the need for the elimination of violence against women. A, states should work to ensure, to the maximum extent feasible, in the light of their available resources and where needed within the framework of international cooperation, that women subjected to violence and, where appropriate, their children have specialized assistance, such as rehabilitation, assistance in childcare and maintenance, treatment, counseling, and health and social services, facilities and programs, as well as support structures, and should take all other appropriate measures to promote their safety and physical and psychological rehabilitation. These measures should include the provision of single-sex services and physical spaces for women and girls, and to provide them with safety, privacy, and dignity. Whether provided by public or private entities, such single-sex provisions should be allocated on the basis of sex, not gender identity, and should be staffed by women on the basis of their sex and not gender identity. B, single-sex provision should include, among other things, specialized services for women and girls subject to violence, such as rape support services, specialist health facilities, specialist police investigation facilities, and shelters for women and children fleeing domestic abuse or other violence. It should also include all other services within which single-sex provisions promote the physical safety, privacy, and dignity of women and girls. These include prisons, health services and hospital wards, substance misuse rehabilitation centers, accommodation for the homeless, toilets, showers and changing rooms, and any other enclosed space where individuals reside or may be in a state of undress. Single-sex facilities designed to meet the needs of women and girls should be at least equal in availability and quality to those provided to men and boys. These facilities should not include men who claim to have female gender identities. States should promote research, collect data, and compile statistics, especially concerning domestic violence, relating to the prevalence of different forms of violence against women, and encourage research on the causes, nature, seriousness, and consequences of violence against women, and on the effectiveness of measures implemented to prevent and redress violence against women. Those statistics and findings of the research will be made public. This should include a recognition that violence against women is one of the crucial social mechanisms by which women as a sex are forced into a subordinate position compared with men as a sex, and that accurate research and data collection relating to violence against women and girls requires that the identification of both the perpetrators and victims of such violence must be based on sex and not gender identity. Sex disaggregated data is data that cross-classified by sex, presenting information separately for men and women, boys and girls. Sex disaggregated data reflects roles, real situations, general conditions of women and men, girls and boys in every aspect of society. When data is not disaggregated by sex, it is more difficult to identify real and potential inequalities. States should include in analyses prepared by organizations and bodies of the United Nations, systems of social trends and problems, such as the periodic reports on the world social situation, examination of trends in violence against women. This should require states to ensure that the identities of perpetrators and victims of violence against women and girls are recorded on the basis of sex and not gender identity by all public bodies, including the police, state prosecutors, and the courts. E, states should develop penal, civil, labor, and administrative sanctions in domestic legislation to punish and redress the wrongs caused to women who are subjected to violence. Women who are subjected to violence should be provided with access to the mechanisms of justice and, as provided for by national legislation, to just and effective remedies for the harm that they have suffered. States should also inform women of their rights in seeking redress through such mechanisms. Finally, this should include the recognition of the right of women and girls to accurately describe the sex of those who have perpetrated violence against them. Public bodies such as the police, state prosecutors, and the courts should not impose an obligation on victims of violence to describe their assailants according to their gender identity rather than their sex. So that is Article 8. Thank you so much. And now I will turn it over to Genevieve Gluck, who is the co-founder of Redux, an amazing feminist magazine that has been around, I think, for just less than a year. And we're very excited to have her here today. Genevieve, I'm turning it over to you now. Thank you.
Great, thank you. Yeah, before we get started, I do just want to mention that I work with a team of women and we co-founded Redux together. So the amount of work that we're putting out, it's really a collaborative team effort. And within the last year, we have published, I believe, 500 articles or nearing that at least at the moment. So it's really been an undertaking, and I'm going to be using some resources from Redux when I speak today. So I wanted to first start by addressing the importance of accurate data. And I know that for a lot of people, this tends to be a kind of boring topic, but it's actually hugely significant in terms of discussing women's rights. We use data for all kinds of things, for awareness, education, but also for lobbying for change, as well as for funding. So it's very important that we have the correct information. I'll go ahead and share my screen now so I can show you what I mean. So this I'm about to show you is an example from Russia, where in 2016, Vladimir Putin decriminalized domestic violence effectively. He softened the law to such an extent that the result was to decriminalize minor forms of domestic violence within the first offense. And the result of that was that the state statistics are now basically unreliable, in that they are showing a decrease in domestic violence because women are less likely to report it, but also it's not even really considered domestic violence in some cases. So yeah, we can clearly see how incorrect data is portraying a false situation. There's some estimates that say domestic violence deaths for women in Russia are somewhere in the range of 40 per day. So we're saying 40 women every day in Russia being killed as a result of domestic violence. Now, these are not perfect numbers, but they are the numbers that we have. I also wanted to mention as well something that I've talked about with the New Jersey prison, Edna Mahan. So I became interested in this story apart from the transgender issue, because they didn't actually start admitting men into the prison until after I had already been looking into some of the horrific levels of violence at this prison. So when we think about sex segregated spaces, I also just wanted to bring up the point that all prisons should be women only. only, I believe, no male employees whatsoever. In the US, I've looked at every single state. I have found systemic abuse by male guards, prison guards, against women in women's prisons in nearly every single state. So when we talk about this issue, we also need to remember we should push back harder on things like this as well. I know it's a lot to keep up with, but single sex provisions means women only. So no male employees, in my opinion. So I wrote this article about how the violence at Edna Mayhem was so reprehensible and so systemic. They actually had to conduct a DOJ investigation into the prison. And then immediately after, started transferring men who identified as transgender into the prison. It was almost like a bait and switch. It was like they were trying to cover up for the fact that they had been investigated. And one of the most egregious examples of this is this man here, Raekwon Rollins. So he was transferred into Edna Mayhem, and then he started assaulting people, women, prison staff, especially prison staff, and he did what's called splashing, which is to throw your feces and urine at the prison guards, essentially. And the result of this was that the prison guards retaliated against the women. So one of the largest prison riots in that prison in recent history was a direct response to the male in the prison acting violently to the prison staff. Of course, I can't say that the staff are not accountable for their actions, but would this have happened if that male hadn't been in the prison inciting violence? We can't know that. So I also wanted to point out how these policies are often championed by men who have extreme fetishes. In this case, this is in the UK, and it regards hospitals, so single-sex wards in hospitals. For those of you who have been following the issue in the UK, you might be aware of the fact that women who have been sexually assaulted or raped in these hospital wards have been told to their faces that there wasn't a man present because the man identified as a woman. So they're being told point blank that the person who sexually abused them wasn't a man. And anyway, so this person, Tara Hewitt, he advised the hospitals to ignore advice from the Equalities and Human Rights Commission. So when the EHRC issued guidances saying that, yes, in fact, you can preserve women-only spaces in the hospitals, this BDSM fetishist, Tara Hewitt, who works on the Equality, Diversity, and Inclusion, told people to ignore the guidance. And of course, he got a response. He got people who were supporting his view on this. As well, in Scotland, a sex offender is responsible for setting guidelines that allowed men to transfer into women's prisons. So this man, Gordon Pike, was later found to have child sexual abuse materials. So this is the caliber of men that we're talking about who are putting these policies into place. When we talk about women's only spaces under threat, there are some pretty egregious examples of this playing out quite terribly. This is in New York. This is Marceline Hardy. Really grotesque, awful murders of women. He mostly targeted sex trafficked women, but he's killed 3 women now, dismembered their bodies, and apparently he was able to access his most recent victim by entering a women's shelter, astonishingly. So Susan Layden, who was the victim most recently that he's set to go to trial for in December, it's really a sad story. And then he ended up, beheading her and dismembering her body. Again, we can see how men will access women's shelters in order to gain access to vulnerable women. This case, Shane Green was in Ontario, Canada, and he entered the women's shelter and raped a woman there just by identifying as transgender. And then, of course, women who speak out against these policies are punished, vilified. They can even be ejected from the shelters if they complain or speak out against these policies. Most recently, this Katie Dolotowski in the UK, on 2 separate occasions, was granted access to women's shelters. One was, I believe, a homeless shelter refuge, and then as well as a domestic violence shelter. And he also had used his transgender status to access the girls' restroom, where he began to take photos of girls in states of undress, which was one of the first recorded offenses that he was known to have. And then, of course, recently he went on to be placed into a women's prison. This is actually quite astonishing because he was transferred into a women's prison after assaulting a man. So he has all of these offenses against women, assaults a man, and then is placed in a women's prison. And the severity of the crime makes no difference in regards to this policy, of course, as we all know. Here's another example from Canada. The details of this case, again, are quite grim. A man who killed a woman and defiled her corpse was allowed to transfer into a women's prison in Canada. This week, we found out that Dana Rivers, a prominent trans activist from the early 2000s, had been found guilty of the triple homicide of a California family. Patricia Reed and Charlotte Wright, or I'm sorry, I might have got that backwards. Charlotte Reed and Patricia Wright were both lesbian women who were killed by Dana Rivers, as well as their son, Benny, was also a victim of this crime. He set fire to the house, was caught fleeing the scene, found with weapons on his person. But now we do not know yet where he's going to be placed. He may, if he wins his insanity plea, he may be put into a psychiatric facility, but that's still to be determined. But anyway, in the state of California, there's nothing whatsoever to prevent him from being placed in a women's prison for these crimes that he committed against women. And some of you here may be familiar with a bit of Rivers' history with his campaigning, which involves campaigning against a women-only music festival that was specifically centered on lesbian women, Mish Fest. So he actually attended at least one protest against their women-only policy in the year, I believe it was in the year 2000. And he was associated with this organization called Camp Trans. Camp Trans is actually a very historically influential incident and lobbying group. And they were effectively terrorizing these women, trying to force their way into the festival. And in one case, it is said by the organizer, Lisa Vogel, at the time, said that some of their property had been vandalized at one point by Camp Trans, who had written along the walls, "Real women have cocks." Here's a couple other cases from around the world where even femicide is being undermined by gender identity. So these 2 trans-identified men murdered a woman who was in the sex industry. They themselves were in the sex industry. And they killed her. And initially, this crime was recorded as a femicide. Some of you may know that there are the highest rates of femicide in the world in South American countries, and Argentina is not an exception there. And so it was recorded as a femicide initially, but after it was discovered that these men identified as women, it no longer was recorded as such.
Genevieve, should we go ahead and move on and hear from Carmen?
I'm sorry, I'm just about done here. I just wanted to show the last example of where a man in Spain was able to avoid domestic abuse charges after he changed his legal status. So there's just a myriad of ways in which this legal fiction that we're creating harms women within data keeping, within statistics, within women's only spaces, and completely undermines our ability to fight against male violence. Okay, thank you. Yes. Let's go ahead and turn it over to Carmen then.
Thank you so much, Genevieve. I really appreciate that. So we're going to go to Carmen now. Carmen is a writer, teacher, a survivor turned advocate for women and girls. And Carmen's going to sort of bring the reality that Genevieve shared with us about what's happening with violence against women and girls all over the world into her own life. And she's going to share some personal stuff with us. So I'm really grateful to you, Carmen, for being here tonight. Thanks. Go ahead.
Thank you, Kara, and thank you for that great introduction. This is a little long, but it's a cry from the heart, and I hope people will bear with me. Hello, I'm Carmen, and in Portland, Oregon, I was recently attacked by a 6-foot-tall masked man who ground a pie into my face, tore out my earring, and tried to topple me into oncoming traffic for discussing the lack of safe spaces for women and girls. I sang a song about male violence in response. I'd like to discuss Clause A of Article 8 with regard to the need for services for vulnerable women from my perspective as a survivor of male violence. I've been in recovery from rape since 2016. This was not my first experience of rape. Unfortunately, that happened when I was 17, and then many times after that. This phenomenon of repeat revictimization is extremely common. In studies I read, likelihood of revictimization for survivors range from 7 to 32 times the chance of a woman who had not been previously victimized, with a higher likelihood of revictimization for those women abused before the age of 18. These cycles of abuse are why women end up in domestic violence relationships, where they are repeatedly abused and sometimes murdered. They're also why women end up in the sex industry, where they play out Freudian repetition compulsion, trying to achieve mastery over their sexual abuse. To achieve what they believe is some modicum of power, they are clawing back from their oppressor's grip, money, or simply to self-annihilate. This is also why victims of sexual abuse and domestic violence engage in masochistic practices with sadistic partners in the sanitized violence of BDSM. It's why women end up in poverty, suffering from drug addiction and multiple mental health problems, and why they end up in prison. More than 80% of women in prison have been victims of sexual assault or child sexual abuse, so much that sexual assault is seen as a prison pipeline for women. I am of this underclass of women. I'm currently struggling with multiple autoimmunity and poverty as a result of repeated sexual and physical violence I've experienced at the hands of men. After it happened to me again, I began to do research as I had nothing left to lose. I researched the kind of men who commit these crimes, how they choose their victims, the phenomenon of revictimization in order to protect myself. When I turned to healing, what I found shocked me. What I found was that there is actually no literature about how women can break out of the cycle of violence or how abused women can avoid abusive men in order to have healthy relationships. I reached out to feminists I knew involved in the cause. One of them sent me a PhD dissertation, which simply researched how many women who get away from one abuser end up with another. There was a single book for male partners of women who'd suffered child sexual abuse, and that was it. The woman I reached out to said, unfortunately, we feminists on the front lines are focused on triage, and now we cannot even guarantee safe shelters. There is no time to begin to think about survivors' reintegration into society. So little has been written. This is a disgrace. There is a whole field of study missing. 8 to 10% of the female population has active PTSD at any given time. This is double the rate of men. Yet just as the most vulnerable women in society go ignored, so too does all scholarship about how to help traumatized women reintegrate into society and avoid further abuse and assault. Furthermore, there is almost no literature on the rapists and abusers known by criminologists as specialists, the everyday men who commit no other crimes except rape and domestic violence. Nearly 100% of rape goes unpunished. We are missing an entire field dedicated to understanding the foundations of male violence and female suffering, to helping the underclass of vulnerable women who are disproportionately affected, a field which is paramount if we actually wish to achieve liberation. Now, not only are we missing vital scholarship and services, something with which I have personally struggled, we do not even have single-sex spaces for women and girls. Let me explain the importance of single-sex spaces for women and girls. This includes not only those admitted to such services, staff members should also be female too. 2 of the men who raped or attempted to rape me worked for rape crisis services or anti-rape advocacy groups. 1 man who assaulted me in college was president of his local chapter of Men Against Rape. The one who assaulted me in 2016 and gave me terrible PTSD had worked in behavioral health, where he gave consent training workshops. After he raped me, he was hired on working for Take Back the Night, an organization which represents rape survivors. When I went to my local Take Back the Night, he was there as a volunteer handing out candles. I saw him with another survivor, his hand on her back. Despite the pain of what he had put me through, I chose to take the stage and read a poem anyway. He didn't stand and watch me as I read my poem about all that sexual assault has taken from me, but busied himself collecting candles as if he were a valued member of the organization. The female organizers of the event later apologized to me, and yet the male organizers that night refused to evict him when I told them. Though they shifted uneasily from foot to foot, said that sounds like stalking, and then invited me to a slut walk. The terrible trauma of seeing him there and the danger he posed to other women seemed completely lost on them. This Take Back the Night I attended focused on violence against males in the LGBT+ community. One of the organizers was a 6'5" middle-aged man with a beard wearing a sparkly tutu who stood up and read statistics about violence against trans women taken from trans-identified males in prostitution in Brazil, where the statistics against females in prostitution are even worse. After this man read, he invited the vulnerable members of my community to come forward, and every single survivor who stood up to tell her story was a heterosexual or bisexual female, a female who dates males, in other words, and none were trans-identified. These were the only survivors who showed up. I remember feeling distinctly confused and wondering why the subject matter of the event was so out of sync with the survivors actually represented. I would later come to see this event as a microcosm for how modern social justice movements have completely ignored and erased female survivors of violence, a fact all the more bewildering in the wake of Me Too, which served to highlight just how much sexual violence against women goes unredressed in our societies, but which was a ripple in the pond that made little real change in the lives of the most vulnerable women. Sexual violence against women is now at an all-time high in our societies, including in the West. In the UK, it's the highest it's been since rates of rape were first recorded in the mid-2000s. In the United States, the highest it's been since the 90s, an era which itself represented a spike in sexual violence against women. These elevated rates of sexual violence have been tied by public health officials to the mainstreaming of pornography, which depicts the sexual abuse of women and girls. When it comes to my story, neither of those men should have been allowed into their respective organizations combating sexual violence against women. Total impunity for rape in our societies is reason enough to keep all males out of women's vulnerable spaces and organizations. And yet, further relaxing such safeguarding is exactly what we're doing now by allowing any man who says he's a woman to identify into vulnerable women's safe spaces. Society is removing women's safe spaces during a historical high in sexual violence against women. I find it doubtful that this is coincidence rather than backlash. What I have since learned is that the majority of serial offenders have a fetish called biastophilia, which is a sexual fetish for committing rape, hearing stories of rape, and an overall obsession with the topic of sexual violence. These men want to be around vulnerable women, particularly rape survivors. This is why allowing males to self-identify into female spaces with the most vulnerable women is so dangerous. And the prediction that predatory men would use this legal loophole to prey upon women and girls has been borne out over and over again. Men have now identified themselves as women in order to rape women in rape crisis shelters, domestic violence shelters, homeless shelters, and prisons. This has already happened dozens of times, despite these policy changes being relatively recent. Allowing men into domestic violence shelters, rape crisis groups, and shelters and prisons poses a special risk, as domestic abusers, rapists, and criminals are the men with the most reason to lie and the least compunction about lying. My mother worked at a DV shelter when I was growing up. The shelter worker had to pick up the survivor to take her to the shelter and use diversionary tactics to make sure they weren't being followed, to make sure no man ever found out the location of the shelter, because abusers would try to find the location in order to kidnap or kill their former partner. This safeguarding is now gone. Any man can identify himself into a domestic violence shelter, rape crisis group, or prison, and this erasure happened by fiat and it happened by stealth. Women, the majority stakeholders when it comes to our rights, And spaces were not even consulted before our spaces were removed from us. This has been happening slowly for years and ramped up in America after President Biden's executive order mandating self-identification in any institutions receiving federal money, signed on his first day in office. Our rights were taken away from us when we weren't even looking. I have personally been looking for a rape crisis group since 2016. I need to speak with other women who understand my experiences. I cannot. There are no more. Every last one has been replaced by all genders groups. The word woman has been taken out of crisis hotlines. The women's crisis line in Portland, where I now live, has been changed to call to safety. This echoes how even the word woman to describe female people is now verboten in our society. Ontological erasure has real consequences to real women, usually the most vulnerable women in society. In my research, I have found that across the nation, there are rape crisis groups for every ethnicity and single-sex groups for minors, but rape crisis groups for adult females are no more. Knowing as I do how rapists love hearing the stories of rape survivors, there is absolutely no way I could ever talk about the details of what's happened to me in front of a male person, regardless of how he identifies. I would have trouble doing that in front of any male, regardless of his mode of presentation. And these days, a man who looks like any other man can sit in on a women's rape crisis group. Therefore, like millions of other female rape survivors, I simply won't go to the rape crisis group that is for all genders, and I will miss out on an important avenue of healing. Vulnerable females are now excluded from our own rehabilitative services and shelters. Furthermore, we are called bigots in need of re-education for complaining. Our understanding of male patterns of predation is dismissed as paranoia as society persists in its collective amnesia of what safeguarding even means. The second wave of feminism brought us so many hard-won rights and spaces to help to begin to address the problem of male violence in society, from campaigning to outlaw marital rape to instituting single-sex rape crisis shelters and domestic violence shelters, which helped women with both healing and consciousness raising. These days, most of these shelters are no longer run by volunteers and funded by charitable donations, but have been largely bankrolled by the state, which has now undone the hard work of our foremothers. There is no reason for this, as the vast money of the LGBTQ+ lobby could easily construct GBTQ+ centers for males vulnerable to male violence, including gay men who experience rape and domestic violence within the gay male community, and trans-identifying males who see themselves as women. There are enough of both groups for their own sections within male shelters that help males vulnerable to male sexual violence. The reason behind allowing males into female safe spaces is entirely selfish. Trans-identifying males want validation that they are women because they say they are women, and the destruction of female spaces is seen as unavoidable collateral damage in service to a fantasy. Male feelings trump female safety every time, it seems. We, the fourth wave, must fight to reestablish single-sex rape crisis and domestic violence support and other shelters for the most vulnerable women in society, such as homeless shelters, even if it means underground networks. And once that work is done, we need to fight for our visibility in the academy, for a field of study which devotes time and resources to the rehabilitation and reintegration of the most marginalized women in our society. It is time that we stop throwing away a whole generation of girls and women because we have refused to address male violence, whether that male violence is wearing a dress or not. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Carmen. I think we were all very moved by hearing your story. And I think we're all very grateful that you shared yourself and your story with us tonight. I know that I am. Thank you for being here.
Thank you.
So we'll now hear from April Morrow, who is the founder of a group called Sovereign Women Speak. I had the pleasure of spending time with April and Sovereign Women Speak this past weekend outside of Tacoma, Washington. April also recently had an encounter. I don't know if this is what April's going to talk about, but April recently was subjected to a form of male violence against women while standing up at a Let Women Speak event in Tacoma, Washington. Over to you, April.
Hi, Kara. Thank you for having me on. Wow, listening to Genevieve and Carmen. Woo, it's really heavy stuff. Well, this is too. What happened? Hold on. I need to share my screen. I believe this is it. Okay. Am I sharing my screen? Can you see it?
I can see a lot of images. If you want us to be looking at one single image, we're not getting that. We're getting okay, there we go. That looks good.
Okay, hold on. Here we go. Hold it. Can you also see the WDI screen across the top of it? Is that in the way?
All I can see right now is Facebook. You're not friends on Facebook. Tollefson Plaza is reserved.
Okay, wonderful. Thank you, Kara.
Okay.
Okay, so what I am going to speak about was I was asked to help organize the Let Women Speak in Seattle. And that was where I started off. So I had chosen the city center, and because of the lack of police that would be available for the event, Kelly J had wanted us to move the location. So it wasn't canceled, but it was moved, and it was moved to Tacoma. The moment it was put out on social media that we would be holding it in Tacoma at the Tolson Plaza, I received a message from Brent Tolson. And he told me that there would be food trucks there on the day that we were going to be there. And he was suggesting that we go elsewhere. So, of course, we felt like, great, there's going to be food trucks. There's going to be more people. It didn't bother us one bit. So we continued to plan to have the event at the Tolson Plaza. Shortly after that, Brent tried to get into the Sovereign Women Speak group, claiming that he was a woman, but of course I knew he was not. It was just kind of a silly thing there. So right away, the school, the Tacoma Art School, which is just south of the Courtyard Marriott that you see right here, they got in contact with the students and put this message out to them that we were anti-transgender and not to engage with us. Yet when we arrived with not only some of the students here, but teachers, parents, maybe a little Antifa mixed in here. And they were all up on the top here, kind of minding themselves, their manners a little bit, right? Yet what happened was the moment that the program began and the first speaker went up, which was Lear Keith, this man here in the, oh, maybe he's not in that picture. Oh, there he is. Yes, he is. In the school, he's trying to look like a little schoolgirl there. He went after her, trying to take her down. And of course, Amy Souza intercepted that. And that was the first attack that they made physically at us. They continued throughout the rest of the speaker's corner to blow their whistles, make as much noise as they could, scream out misogynistic slurs. But then what happens is they start to come down, they work their way down, and pretty soon they're all the way down onto the bottom tier with us. I include this because this is proof that I was there as a journalist to record this. And I was minding my own business. I was not even engaging with these people when this is what happens here. I will just play this here for you. They all start to come down.
April, oh my God. Yeah, down there. Go help her, Ryan, please. Get them up from the middle where those boys are. They stole her stuff. Go.
So this is Elijah Lane. He is the man that broke my left hand, threw me to the ground, and broke my journaling equipment. The police were called a couple of dozen times and they did not show. The day after this event, I went and spoke at the Tacoma Art School, at their city, their board meeting, the school board meeting, and found out that, so he was arrested and he was put in jail. Oh, hold it. This is not what I want. Hold on. This right here, this picture, I was really out of it. I was really in shock here, leaving. So these were there's several of them. I'm not going to share them all, but there were several posts that went out onto social media making fun of how I was injured. And the post I'm trying to get to, let's see. Oh, here we go. This is what I was looking for. This woman here is the mother of one of the children. And she has, I'm not sure if she has a son or a daughter, but she has a trans identified child. And she was on the school board. And this is what we're dealing with. So you go to a school board meeting and you give your story, but when you're talking to a mother who is looking at you like you're a bigot, you're feeling pretty hopeless that you're really ever going to get anywhere. The man, Elijah Lane, was let out of jail immediately. I have been calling for 3 weeks, trying to get the DA to find out what is happening and what they are going to do so that we can follow through with a lawsuit on this. And I still have heard nothing. Every time I call, they tell me just to keep trying to call back, that they're very busy. So I do plan to follow suit and sue the Tacoma Art School and Elijah Lane. I want to also share with you that I had an event planned for 2 weeks after the Let Women Speak. And we were planning to go out to the Capitol to hold a speaker's corner. Kara Danksy flew out from DC and Lear was here, and we had a group of women, and we were going to go to the Capitol. And what had happened was we went elsewhere. And the reason why is because we had a woman post out on Twitter and Facebook to the Proud Boys and to the 3%ers that we were going to be there and that we needed their protection. And we know that when you get two violent male groups together, that we're going to have a lot of trouble and violence. So we decided to go elsewhere. But these are the men that are waiting to shut down and harm women. Rory, a man that was helping us, was there to make sure that any of the women that were going to be showing up and did not know that we would not be there, we were very concerned for them. So he stayed there and waited for them, and he drew that. I thought that was just so beautiful. He drew that down there to show the women where he was, where the protection was, and for him to take them back to their cars. And this right around the corner here was about 60 more TRAs and Antifa waiting to join these men once we showed up. So we would have been up against almost 100 people against 15 of us. And this is what we're dealing with anytime we try to speak in public. We're just dealing with a lot of violence. And I think that as a movement, we really need to be working towards really figuring out how to be able to speak in public without this nonsense and this fear of being harmed. And I know that our our police departments are a big part of the problem. Here where I live anyway, they're so defunded that there's just not enough power to help out these type of protests. So I, in the past, with everything that I have done with Sovereign Women Speak, have kept everything really safe without any training for NVDA. That was my choice that I chose to take. And my first time that I went to try to do something in public, this is, you know, what I was dealing with. So for future, I think, you know, gathering together and figuring out. Oh, I'm trying to get back to not sharing my screen. How do I get out of this?
Have you got an end screen share option?
Stop share.
Stop share?
Did that do it?
Yep, you're good.
Okay, so that is what happened in Washington here. And that doesn't mean I'm going to give up or I'm going to quit. Matter of fact, it's just going to make me try even harder. But this is what we're dealing with to be able to speak out in public. It's basically putting our lives on the line and knowing that we could get anywhere from hurt to even being killed with this group of people. So anyway, Kara, thank you for letting me share my story. I really appreciate it.
Thank you, April. Thank you for sharing that. I want to just say quickly before getting into questions, April referenced the Proud Boys and the 3%ers, and probably most of us are familiar with the Proud Boys. Probably most of us are not familiar with 3%ers. I know that I was not until this past weekend. April knows much more than I do, but my understanding is the 3%ers are sort of another kind of all male, alt-right, hyper-masculine, right-wing militia that are not the Proud Boys and don't like the Proud Boys, but are similar to the Proud Boys. Do I have that about right, April?
Yes.
So, and so I think the point that April's making there is that the woman who put out the call for protection from right-wing militiamen was a bit misguided in having done that and caused us to have to cancel our event. So that's what happened. I don't want to dwell too much on that unless there are questions about that, in which case I'm happy to answer, and I'm sure April is as well. So I am happy to field audience questions, and if you have any, please, rather than put them in the chat, put them in the Q&A. And while we're doing that, I want to pose a question, and it's a difficult one that I know that we all grapple with, and it's, okay, so the declaration calls for an end to violence against women. Could panelists put video on, if you don't mind, so we're all here together at the same time? Great, thank you, Carmen, Genevieve, great. Genevieve, so how are we gonna end this? What are we gonna do? And I hate asking that question because it's not women's responsibility to end male violence against women. Nonetheless, we all want an end to male violence against women. And the declaration makes some really important points about steps that governments ought to take to end male violence against women. And that's all great. And we should celebrate it, and we should absolutely continue to advance the declaration, including Article 8. Segueing off of what April was saying, and given what we've seen in some recent events, I think many of us have questionable faith in the willingness or ability of state actors, namely police and prosecutors, to bring justice to the perpetrators of male violence against women. I'm not saying we need to give up hope on the state actors. I'm just saying we need to recognize their limitations, and I think we all do. Given that state of affairs, would all of you share just a minute or two worth of thoughts on how our society can deal with the epidemic of male violence against women and girls? I know none of us have the silver bullet, but just share some thoughts, just riff on some ideas. Genevieve, go ahead.
Yeah, this is a really difficult question, how to end male violence. I think it's kind of an age-old question. It's not clear if we can ever totally eradicate male violence, but the steps that we can take to address it, I think I've noticed that within the pushback against the gender identity movement, a lot of women have very different approaches. There's a wide range of kind of ways to counteract that everyone's bringing to the table. So the excellent work by the Women for the Let Women Speak event being one of those things, as well as trying to do record keeping. So I think that incorporating all of these different aspects within the movement is very helpful to have many different facets. And I also just wanted to reiterate the importance of keeping accurate record of what's actually happening now and showing that to the public. So when you're doing the on the ground events, the public can see the video, like we saw with New York, how that video went viral, and that shows to the wider world what's going on. And as well, with Redux, trying to get that accurate information out there to the public. So in my perspective, I feel that offering the information up to people, showing people what's happening is one of the most effective techniques for getting people to understand what is actually happening here. And so I just wanted to reiterate that point, again, with excellent work of the Let Women Speak event that you all have been doing. And I think, I don't remember who said this, but maybe it was Amy Sousa, I can't remember, but said, let this be a record of my dissent. And I just thought that was so perfect, that in all of our various ways, we are recording our own dissent. And I just think that's really powerful.
Kara, are you frozen? Oh. Should I go? Well, for me, I think that the most effective work, I've been in this work for such a short period of time, and I've had a little sample of, the protesting, a little bit of everything, education, the pamphleting and leafleting, talking to people. But I think for me, the lobbying and the legislating was the most powerful. I think that when we can change laws and make laws that benefit women and protect us, that is the core of where it starts with. So if we don't have those laws protecting us, right? So I don't know. I don't have the answer, but I have very little experience, but in the little experience I've had, I think that the law is very big. So I think legislating and lobbying to make sure that we are protected in law and language is probably, for me, one of the most effective ways to make change.
I agree with everything that's been said so far. I think the law, I'm considering law school myself. Law, I think, is definitely one of the most important avenues that we can use for sort of the multi-pronged approach to attacking this problem. I was very shocked when I was trying to research, if there were, for example, any supportive materials for like the partners of women who have experienced male violence, or even for the women themselves in terms of how to avoid re-experiencing male violence, and how to sort of get the help that they need to avoid being targets, because that's what I talked about in my piece, is how often it's the same kind of underclass of women who get sucked into this male violence, who are repeatedly targeted. Oftentimes, sometimes, through things that women are doing to try to cope, and oftentimes through absolutely no reason at all, except for whatever initially, caused these women to be targeted. We don't actually have, and that is not to victim blame whatsoever. I want to just get that out of the way. That's not what this is about. It's about we have a lot in the feminist movement. We have a whole lot of data about male violence and not enough about the female suffering, and not enough about how women who have been through male violence are coping and trying to reintegrate into society so that it doesn't continue to happen to them, how it affects their health, physical and mental health, the long-term effects of male violence and all that. Like I said in my piece, in my opinion, there is an entire field that's missing. And I think that women who are scholars, which I think we all are kind of scholars here, need to get involved in academia and start doing research in this regard and start really pushing this in the academy. Look how queer theory got pushed in the academy. Queer theory, which excuses, the men who commit these kinds of crimes. It's a very convenient framework for them, isn't it? When you queer what actually causes the problem and say, oh no, it's not, this is not what's causing the problem, it's speaking about it that's causing the problem. Or we can speak about it differently and that'll change the problem. Or we can play pretend and that'll change the problem. It's a very convenient kind of framework for them, isn't it? So what we need is a framework for understanding the impact of violence against women that is as mainstreamed as queer theory. So I definitely think the academy is another place that we definitely need to work on this, because those ideas do trickle down. And then the third thing that I did mention at the very end of the speech that I wrote for this is that I think that we need a revival of the second wave, because essentially all of our spaces have been taken away from us. And it's because of the fact that we relied on the state to help us. And that was not, as we can see, we can't trust them. And so actually we need to begin to redo this underground railroad for women. Women who are actually struggling need to have a group of people that they can turn to go to. And I think the more that we begin to try doing that, and the more that they attack us while we're trying to do that, the more that this will also get into the public. Like, I want to create a rape crisis support group for females only in Portland. I will definitely be attacked if I do that. But that would also get into the news, wouldn't it? So this is another avenue, is a revival of the second wave, particularly consciousness raising. That's
Carmen. No, it's all good. It's all good. I just want to respect everyone's time and make sure we end at the top of the hour. I want to quickly, because there's a question for all of you that I want to get to, and then we'll end right at the top of the hour. Nina has a question about what is the best tactic to get involved. I'm just going to refer everyone, please go to www.womensdeclarationusa.com if you haven't, and complete a volunteer application, and we will get in touch with you and we can cover all of those things and figure out ways to get you plugged in. But in the meantime, anonymous attendee has a question for Carmen and April. How are you coping after these incidents? And a similar question for Genevieve. How do you deal with having to research and report such distressing news? So with the last minute, if you could all give like a 20 to 30 second summary of how are you doing? How are you coping? It gets right back to what Carmen just said. In any order, go.
Well, I'm coping with my physical disability of my hand. I'm unable to teach. I've had some friends help out financially. I've been fundraising. As far as the PTSD goes, that has taken me a while to get everything calmed down. But I feel that I'm there. So it took a while, but I'm feeling much better now. It's been a couple, 2-3 weeks, but it did take that long. People don't realize, unless you've been in a mob like that, of hateful people screaming at you, and you don't realize it unless you've been in that. So it takes a while to recover from it. And I'm feeling pretty good about it, Kara.
Thank you, April. Carmen?
Sure. Yeah, really quick. As I mentioned, I have multiple autoimmunity because of my PTSD. They're linked. And so I had an autoimmune flare. I got really sick, lasted about a week. I was actually lucky that it was only a week, because sometimes they can last months. So yeah, it did affect me. And I'm going to try to lend my voice as a writer more and more, and maybe avoid the front lines for a little while.
Great. Thank you, Carmen. And we'll finish up with you, Genevieve. Do you want to give us a 30-second? I know it's too long for 30 seconds, but how on earth do you research all of this stuff?
Yeah, people ask me that question occasionally, and I'm never really sure how to answer because I have to compartmentalize. You just have to, when you're reading about extremely violent men and seeing effectively the world kind of going insane to accommodate them, I have to be able to do things for myself. Like I took up distance running, for example, which I've said before, I'll say again, I strongly recommend running in particular for mental health reasons, because you get that runner's high. So even if you're having a bad day or you're in a down, dark place, there are ways to try to lift yourself out of that. And I know that that's going to be different for each person, but for me, I do try to kind of pull myself out of that. And then also to keep in mind, I'm actually very fortunate. I'm very lucky that I haven't been severely affected by this in ways that many women have, like women in prisons. And so if I'm able to do something, then I feel I have a responsibility to do something for women who maybe don't have that opportunity. So yeah, that's my piece. Kara, would you like to close out?
Okay, great. Thank you so much. And I'm sorry I have intermittently turned my video on and off because my Wi-Fi is shaky, but thank you so much, everyone who attended. Thank you, Genevieve. Thank you, Carmen. Thank you, April. Thank you all for sharing your stories and your incredibly important information with all of us. We will get this video up on YouTube as soon as we can. Thank you to everyone who attended. We'll talk soon.